You think you know what grief does to a man? You think it just makes him sad? No, it freezes him. It turns his heart into a stone and his world into a silent, white landscape. For Arthur Prescott, that wasn't a metaphor. It was Montana, 1884. 5 years. 5 years since he'd buried his wife, Martha, and their little boy, Tom. 5 years since the fever stole the only warmth he'd ever known. He retreated into the mountains, into the punishing silence of the snow, hoping the cold outside would numb the cold inside. He was a ghost, haunting his own life, tending his cattle, chopping his wood, his face a mask carved from ice. He didn't live. He just was. Then the blizzard came. Not a storm, a monster. A roaring, white demon that swallowed the world for 3 straight days. Arthur hunkered down, the wind screaming like a soul in torment, and he just listened. It was the only voice that understood his own. On the 4th morning, the world went quiet. A bruised, heavy sky hung over a landscape of impossible white. He knew he had to check his fences, check for cattle the storm might have spared. He pulled on his hides, grabbed his rifle, and stepped out into the frozen tomb of his valley. It was near the creek, where the cottonwood trees looked like skeletons reaching for a dead sky, that he saw it. A shape, a dark lump against the blinding white. He figured it was a log, maybe a dead calf. But as he got closer, his heart, that frozen stone in his chest, gave a single, painful thump. He saw the edge of a beaded moccasin. He saw a sweep of black hair, like spilled ink on a fresh page. He saw the faintest, shallowest rise and fall of a shoulder. It was a person, a woman, and she was a breath away from being swallowed by the snow for good. Every instinct screamed at him. Walk away. This isn't your problem. The wilderness that took your family can have this one too. You built these walls of ice around your heart for a reason. Don't let anything crack them now. He knelt, his rifle ready, and brushed the snow from her face. She was native, dressed in worn deerskin. Her face was gaunt but strong. Her skin was so cold it felt like stone. He pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready, weak, a tiny bird fluttering against the cage of death. But it was there. An image flashed in his mind. Martha, her face pale, her breath shallow, just like this. He let out a curse that turned to smoke in the frigid air, a sound that was half pain, half fury. He couldn't do it. He couldn't just leave her. With a grunt that tore from his soul, he scooped her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of sticks and spirit. He turned back toward the cabin, each step a war against the snow, against the wind, against the ghost of his own past. He didn't know it then, but he wasn't just carrying a stranger back to his fire. He was carrying a lit fuse, and his whole frozen world was about to explode. He laid her on the rough floorboards by the hearth, not on his bed. An invisible line had already been drawn. He stood over her, this person who had fallen out of the sky and into the dead center of his solitude. Her breathing was a tiny, rasping sound in the dead quiet of the cabin. He worked with a grim purpose, stripping off her frozen, snow-caked clothes. Her deerskin dress was thin, her moccasins worn through. He rubbed her hands and feet, his touch rough, impersonal, trying to force life back into limbs that felt like marble. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blanket and brewed coffee, black and strong enough to raise the dead. He lifted her head, trying to trickle the hot liquid between her lips. Most of it ran down her chin. He didn't care. He just kept the fire roaring, the cabin growing so warm he could feel sweat on his own brow. He was a machine built to survive. And for some reason he couldn't explain, his purpose was now to make sure she survived too. Hours crawled by. The sun began to dip, painting the snow outside in shades of blood and ice. And then she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Dark, deep-set eyes blinked open, trying to focus. They landed on his bearded face, on the unfamiliar log walls, and they widened with the pure, raw terror of a trapped animal. She tried to push herself up, a choked cry catching in her throat. "Easy now," Arthur said. His voice was a rusty hinge, creaking from disuse. "You were near frozen. Found you in the snow." She didn't speak. She just watched him, Her gaze was a physical thing, intense and searching. He could almost see the thoughts racing behind her eyes as she took in her situation. Weak, unarmed, alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. He offered her a cup of water. This time she drank, her hand trembling as she held the tin cup. His own calloused hand steadied hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a strange jolt through the room. "What's your name?" he asked, mostly to fill the silence. Her lips parted. She looked at him for a long moment, a debate raging in her eyes. Then she spoke, her voice a soft, raspy whisper. "Winona." "Arthur Prescott," he replied. "Just a fact, nothing more." But as he looked at her, he noticed something. The fear in her eyes wasn't just about him. It was something deeper. She wasn't just looking at him. She was listening. Listening to the wind outside. Listening for something else. He'd assumed she was lost. A victim of the storm. He was wrong. She wasn't lost. She was hiding. The next few days were a tightrope walk of silence and suspicion. Winona recovered her strength, but she moved like a shadow in his small cabin. She was quiet, watchful, her eyes missing nothing. She spoke only when he spoke to her, her English careful and hesitant. Arthur kept his distance, a gruff, silent wall. He slept on the floor by the door, his rifle always within arm's reach. He told himself it was just caution, but he wasn't sure if he was protecting her from the world or protecting himself from her. In short, broken sentences, she told him her story. She was Lakota. Her people were scattered. She was trying to reach a band of relatives rumored to be far to the north. She'd been traveling for weeks. She didn't talk about how she'd ended up in the blizzard, alone and half dead. The details were a locked room he didn't have the key to. But Arthur wasn't a fool. He saw the way she'd flinch at the sound of a branch snapping outside. He saw how her eyes would dart to the window whenever the wind howled a certain way. This wasn't a woman simply beaten down by a long journey. This was a woman on the run. One afternoon he was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thump of the axe the only sound in the valley. He happened to glance back at the cabin. He saw her face in the small window, watching the trail that led down from the mountain pass. Her expression wasn't one of hope. It was one of pure, gut-wrenching dread. Later that night, the air in the cabin was thick with things unsaid. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, the scent of gun oil filling the space between them. She spoke suddenly, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "They will come." Arthur's hand stopped moving. He didn't look at her. "Who will come?" "The men who were following me," she whispered. "They are the reason I was in the storm. I was trying to lose them." Every hair on Arthur's neck stood on end. He had spent 5 years building a fortress of solitude, and now he realized he hadn't just let a stranger in. He had let a war in. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low. "White men. Trappers, I think. They wanted something I have." He looked up at her, then. The firelight flickered across her face, showing him the deep fear in her eyes. But there was something else there, too. A glint of steel. A refusal to break. Before he could ask more, a sound from outside cut through the night. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a heavy branch snapping under a boot. It wasn't the wind. Winona's head shot up, her eyes wide with terror. Arthur was on his feet in a second. Rifle in his hand, his body moving on pure instinct. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the dying orange glow of the fire. He crept to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the logs. The moon was bright, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. For a moment he saw nothing, then a flicker of movement near the tree line. Not an animal. It was a man, and then another. 2 of them. They were on foot, moving slowly, cautiously, their rifles held at the ready. They weren't just passing through. They were hunting, and Winona was their prey. Arthur felt a cold fury rise in him, something he hadn't felt in years. This was his land, his valley, his solitude. And these men had violated it. They had brought their violence and their greed into his sanctuary of grief. He looked over at Winona. She was huddled by the cold hearth, her face a pale mask in the gloom. She was looking at him, her eyes asking a silent question. Would he fight? Or would he hand her over? In that moment, Arthur Prescott made a choice. He had let his family die because he couldn't fight a fever. He would not let this woman die because he was afraid to fight men. He pressed the cold stock of the rifle to his cheek, aimed into the darkness, and the world held its breath. The silence stretched on, thin and brittle. The two figures out in the snow were like wolves, circling, testing the defenses. They clearly hadn't expected to find her shacked up with a rancher. They were confused, and that made them dangerous. Arthur's mind was racing. He was one man. There were two of them, maybe more. His cabin was solid, but it wasn't a fort. They could just wait him out. Or worse, they could try to burn him out. He felt Winona's presence behind him, a silent anchor in the terrifying darkness. He could feel her watching him, trusting him. It was a weight he hadn't carried in 5 long years. "Stay away from the window," he whispered, his voice a low growl. He watched the men split up. One started circling around toward the barn, trying to get a different angle. The other knelt behind a large snowdrift, his rifle pointed directly at the cabin door. A classic pincer move. They were professionals, or at least they had done this before. A thought struck Arthur, cold and sharp as an icicle. How did they track her through a blizzard? It was impossible. Unless they hadn't. Unless they knew exactly where she would end up. But how could they? This valley was miles from anything. It was a dead end. Unless it wasn't. The man by the snowdrift grew impatient. "We know she's in there, Prescott." A voice boomed across the valley, rough and laced with menace. "Send out the squaw and we'll leave you be." Prescott. They knew his name. The blood in Arthur's veins turned to ice. These weren't random trappers. This wasn't a chance encounter. They knew him, which meant they were local, which meant he probably knew them. He didn't answer. Let them wonder. Let them get nervous. "Don't be a fool," the voice called out again. "She ain't worth dying for. Just give her to us. It's got nothing to do with you." But it did now. They had made it his business when they put their dirty boots on his land. When they called his name in the dead of night. The other man had reached the barn. Arthur could see his silhouette moving in the shadows. He was going to try to get a shot through the cabin's smaller back window. Arthur had to do something. He had to split their attention. He looked around the dark cabin. His eyes landed on a pile of old rags soaked in lantern oil he kept for starting stubborn fires. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. He moved quickly, silently. He handed his rifle to Winona. "If anyone but me comes through that door, you shoot," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Her eyes widened, but she took the heavy weapon, her small hands wrapping around the stock with a surprising firmness. He grabbed the oily rags and a match. He crept to the back of the cabin, to the small root cellar door built into the floor. He lifted it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Cold, earthy air wafted up. He lit the rags. They caught with a sudden whoosh, blossoming into a ball of greasy orange flame. Without a second's hesitation, he tossed the flaming bundle out the narrow cellar opening on the far side of the cabin. The rags landed in a deep snowdrift near the corner of the barn, casting wild dancing shadows. "Hey, what was that?" The man near the barn yelled, distracted. It was the opening Arthur needed. He scrambled back to the front window, took aim at the man near the snowdrift, and fired. The shot was a deafening roar that shattered the night. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed for the ground, just in front of the man's feet. Snow and dirt erupted, spraying the man's face. The man yelped in surprise and pain, scrambling backward, his own rifle firing wildly into the sky. "He's shooting! Get back!" The two men retreated, disappearing back into the darkness of the tree line. Arthur stayed at the window, his heart hammering against his ribs, every muscle tense. He listened. The silence returned, deeper and more threatening than before. They were gone. For now. But they would be back. They knew where he was. And they knew he wasn't going to give up Winona. He turned from the window. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Winona was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of fear and something else. Awe. "They knew your name," she whispered. Arthur said, reloading the rifle. "They did." He walked over to the fire and kicked the embers back to life. A small flame flickered, pushing back the darkness. He had to think. They couldn't stay here. The cabin was a trap. They needed to move. But where? The passes were still thick with snow. Going back to civilization meant walking right toward the men who were hunting them. He looked at Winona. What did you take from them? She hesitated for a long moment. Then she reached into the folds of her deerskin dress and pulled out a small, intricately beaded leather pouch. It was the same pouch he had seen her mending just a few days ago. She opened it and tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't beads, it wasn't money, it was a rock, a strange, heavy black rock, with a thick vein of shimmering yellow gold running through it. It looked wrong, unnatural. My people call it the poison stone, she said softly. It comes from the sacred mountain, near the head of the creek. They are digging it up. It makes the water sick. It makes the animals die. It makes the people fade. Arthur stared at the rock, a terrible, sickening feeling of dread coiling in his gut. The head of the creek. His creek. The same creek he and his family had drunk from for years. The fever. It hadn't been a fever. It had been poison. And these men, the men in the woods, they were the ones responsible. They hadn't just brought a war to his doorstep tonight, they had brought it 5 years ago. And he had never even seen the enemy. The revelation hit Arthur like a physical blow. 5 years of frozen, hollow grief, all built on a lie. Martha and Tom weren't taken by a random act of God. They were murdered. Murdered by the slow creeping poison that had seeped into the water, into their lives, all for a piece of shiny rock. A rage unlike anything he had ever known began to thaw the ice in his veins. It was a hot, righteous fury that burned away the apathy, the despair. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't just surviving. He had a reason to fight. He had a reason to live. He looked from the poisoned stone in Winona's hand to her face. He saw his own loss reflected in her haunted eyes. Her people, her land, taken by the same sickness, the same greed. Their two separate tragedies were just two threads in the same dark tapestry. Redemption, he said, the name of the nearest town tasting like ash in his mouth. The settlement, it's the closest place. The men who came tonight, they're from there. Winona's face tightened. It is a bad place. I know, Arthur said, but we can't stay here. They'll be back with more men, and we can't outrun them in the mountains. Not yet. He began to pace the small cabin, his mind working faster than it had in years. There's a lawman in Redemption, a marshal. He's not much, but he's the law. This stone, he gestured to the rock in her hand, this is proof. We take this to him. We tell him everything. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. The town was full of rough men, men who would side with their own against a grieving rancher and a native woman. But it was the only move they had. Hiding was no longer an option. The only way out was through. We leave at first light, he said, his voice hard as iron. We ride straight there, no stopping. They spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, taking turns watching the tree line. But the men didn't return. They were planning their next move, just as Arthur was planning his. As the first gray fingers of dawn touched the sky, they made ready. Arthur packed what little they would need: ammunition, dried meat, 2 rifles. He gave Winona his calmest mare, a sturdy pack animal, while he saddled his own gelding. The air was crisp and cold, the world silent, as if holding its breath. As he helped her mount the horse, their hands touched. Her skin was warm. He looked into her eyes and saw a fragile trust that felt more valuable than all the gold in the mountain. He had pulled her from the snow, a stranger. Now she was his partner in a war he never knew he was fighting. She held the proof of his family's murder, and he was her only shield against the men who want it back. Stay close to me, he said, his voice low, no matter what happens. She nodded, her chin held high, a quiet strength radiating from her. I am not afraid, Arthur Prescott. They rode out of the valley as the sun rose, casting long shadows behind them. The cabin, which had been his prison of grief for so long, now looked like a sanctuary they were leaving behind. They were riding out of the wild and into the so-called civilized world. But Arthur knew, the real savages weren't in the mountains. They were in the town ahead, and they were waiting. The journey to redemption was a long, tense line pulled taut. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a distant hawk sent a jolt through Arthur's system. He rode with his rifle across his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, the ridges, the gullies. Winona rode beside him, a silent, proud figure, her gaze just as alert. They were two wolves moving through enemy territory. They saw no one on the trail. But that didn't bring Arthur any comfort. It felt wrong, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath before a storm. He knew Logan. He was almost certain the voice from the night before belonged to Bart Logan, a loud-mouthed bully who ran a small freighting crew, and Logan wasn't the type to give up easily. This silence was a threat. As they neared the town, the landscape changed. The pristine snow gave way to muddy, rutted tracks. The clean scent of pine was replaced by the smell of wood smoke and manure. Redemption wasn't much more than a single muddy street carved out of the wilderness, lined with ugly, unpainted buildings. Its name was a bitter joke. There was no redemption here, only desperation and greed. They rode down the main street, and it was like a scene from a nightmare. Conversation stopped. Men leaning on porch posts straightened up, their eyes following them. Faces appeared in dusty windows. It was a silent, hostile reception. Every single person in this town knew who they were and why they were here. The stares were hard, cold, and full of hate. They weren't just looking at a rancher and a native woman. They were looking at a problem, an inconvenience. Arthur felt Winona tense beside him, but she didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, her back rigid. He felt 100 rifles aimed at his back. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Logan hadn't just gone back to town. He had turned the whole town against them. They stopped in front of the largest building, which had a faded sign that read, Henderson's General Store and Assay Office. This was it. This was where the poison stone would be identified. And right next door was the marshal's office, a tiny, sad-looking shack. "Stay here," Arthur said to Winona, dismounting. He tied their horses to the hitching rail. "Keep the rifle. If anything happens—" He didn't need to finish. She understood. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door to the general store. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust, cured meat, and something else. Fear. Mr. Henderson, a fat man with beady little eyes, was behind the counter. He looked up, and when he saw Arthur, a flicker of panic crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Prescott," Henderson said, his voice slick with false confidence. "Didn't expect to see you." "I need you to assay a rock for me, Henderson," Arthur said, his voice flat and cold. He walked to the counter and placed the heavy black and gold rock on the wood. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed in the silent store. Henderson stared at the rock. He didn't touch it. He looked at it like it was a coiled rattlesnake. All the color drained from his face. He knew exactly what it was. I can't do that," he stammered. "My equipment is broken." "Fix it," Arthur said. Suddenly the store's front door creaked open. Arthur didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He could feel the menace that walked in behind him. Now, Henderson," a familiar, gravelly voice drawled. "That's no way to treat a customer." It was Bart Logan. Arthur turned slowly. Logan was standing there, a smug, ugly grin on his face. Behind him were his two cronies from the other night, and 4 more men, all of them hard-faced and armed. They blocked the only exit. The trap had been sprung. "Fancy seeing you here, Prescott," Logan said, his eyes glittering with malice. "Decided to bring our property back into town?" He nodded toward the window where Winona sat on her horse, rifle in hand. "And the little thief who stole it." "It's not your property, Logan," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "It came from my land, from the creek that you poisoned." Logan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your land? Nothing in that valley is yours. We just let you grieve on it for a while. But our patience has run out." He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "That rock and the squaw, they belong to me. Now you can hand them over and ride out of here. Or you can die here, with her. Your choice." The store was silent. Henderson was sweating, his eyes darting between Logan and Arthur. The other men were spreading out, flanking them. Arthur looked at Logan's smug, cruel face, the face of the man who had murdered his family and felt nothing, the face of the man who was about to do it again. And Arthur knew he wasn't walking out of the store. He was going to burn it to the ground. "There's a third choice," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Logan raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, what's that?" Arthur's hand moved in a blur. It didn't go for his gun. It shot out and grabbed the big, heavy assay scale on the counter, a monstrous thing of brass and iron. With a roar of pure, pent-up fury, he swung it with all his might directly at Logan's head. Logan's eyes went wide with shock. He tried to duck, but it was too late. The heavy scale smashed into the side of his face with a sickening crunch. He staggered back. A cry of pain ripped from his throat, blood pouring from a deep gash on his temple. Chaos erupted. The men behind Logan surged forward, reaching for their guns. Arthur didn't wait. He vaulted over the counter, sending jars and tins crashing to the floor. He landed next to the terrified Henderson. "The back door!" Arthur snarled, grabbing the storekeeper by his shirt. "Where is it?" Henderson, pale and trembling, pointed a shaky finger toward a curtained doorway. Outside, the first gunshot rang out, a rifle shot. Winona. She was holding up her end of the bargain. Arthur shoved Henderson toward the back, using him as a human shield. One of Logan's men raised a pistol, but hesitated, not wanting to shoot his boss's partner. That hesitation was all Arthur needed. He kicked over a barrel of flour, sending a huge white cloud into the air, momentarily blinding everyone. He burst through the curtain into a dark, cluttered storeroom. He could hear shouting and cursing from the main store. He slammed a heavy bar across the door, buying them a few precious seconds. "There's no way out," Henderson squealed, his eyes wild with terror. "The back is boarded up." Arthur ignored him. His eyes scanned the storeroom. Crates, barrels, shelves piled high with goods. And on one shelf he saw it, a crate with a familiar red label stenciled on the side. Danger. Dynamite. A new plan, a terrible and beautiful plan, bloomed in his mind. He grabbed a pickaxe that was leaning against the wall and started smashing at the crate. Wood splintered. "What are you doing? Are you insane?" Henderson shrieked. "You poisoned my family," Arthur grunted, his voice guttural, each word punctuated by a blow from the pickaxe. "You destroyed my life for money." He ripped the lid off the crate, revealing neatly packed sticks of dynamite. "You wanted to own the valley. Fine. You can have it." He grabbed several sticks and a length of fuse. From outside, he could hear the men starting to break down the storeroom door. He could hear Logan screaming his name, his voice thick with rage and pain. He looked at Henderson, who was now weeping, a pathetic, blubbering mess. "The marshal's office," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. "Is there a tunnel? A connection?" Henderson's eyes widened. He nodded frantically. "Yes, behind the shelves. My father had it built, in case of robberies." The door behind them began to splinter. Arthur worked with lightning speed. He shoved a shelf unit aside, revealing a small hidden door. He lit the fuse on the dynamite. It was a long fuse, maybe a minute long. He hoped. He shoved the sputtering dynamite into Henderson's hands. "You have a choice," Arthur said, his eyes burning with cold fire. "You can stay here and die with your friends. Or you can run through that tunnel, go to the marshal, and tell him everything. Tell him what you did. Maybe, just maybe, he'll save your worthless life." He didn't wait for an answer. He opened the tunnel door, shoved Henderson through it, and then scrambled in after him, pulling the door shut just as Logan's men burst into the storeroom. He could hear their confused shouts, then a terrified scream as someone saw the lit dynamite in the middle of the room. Arthur scrambled through the dark, musty tunnel, pushing Henderson ahead of him. It was a tight fit, the air thick with the smell of dirt and desperation. Behind them, a muffled, tremendous boom shook the very foundations of the earth. The store, the greed, the poison, all of it was being erased in a single violent roar of fire and judgment. They burst out into the back of the marshal's office. The marshal, an old man with a drooping mustache and startled eyes, was just getting to his feet, his gun drawn. Henderson fell to the floor sobbing, still clutching the unlit dynamite Arthur had given him as a bluff. Outside, the world was chaos. People were shouting. The entire town was running toward the pillar of black smoke that was once Henderson's store. Arthur didn't pause. He ran to the front door of the marshal's office. He saw Winona still on her horse, her face grim, the rifle smoking in her hands. She had held them off. She had kept them pinned down. But now the whole town was in an uproar. Men with guns were starting to pour into the street, their faces angry and confused. They were trapped. One man, one woman, and a terrified, broken storekeeper against a town built on a lie. The explosion had bought them a moment, but it had also turned every man in redemption into their enemy. The law had failed them. Now there was only one law left, the law of survival. The marshal, a man named Silas Croft, stared at the scene, his mind slowly catching up. The pillar of smoke, the terrified store owner babbling on his floor, the grim-faced rancher and the Lakota woman outside, surrounded by an emerging mob. Prescott, what in God's name is going on? Silas stammered. Justice is going on, Marshal, Arthur said, his voice ringing with authority. He strode over to the sobbing Henderson and ripped the poison stone from his pocket, tossing it onto the marshal's desk. Logan and Henderson have been running an illegal mine up the creek. The runoff from it is pure poison. It's what killed my wife and son. It's what's killing her people. He jerked his head toward Winona. They hunted her to keep it quiet. They tried to kill us to protect their gold. The noise from the street was growing louder. A mob mentality was taking hold. Voices were shouting, calling for blood. Arthur's blood. Winona's blood. They blew up the store, someone yelled. They're murderers, screamed another. Silas looked from the rock to Arthur's burning eyes, then to the terrified face of Henderson. He was an old man, and not a particularly brave one. He could see his peaceful, if corrupt, town about to be torn apart. I can't, he began. You have to, Arthur cut him off. You're the law, or does Logan's money own that badge too? That stung. A flicker of old pride sparked in the marshal's weary eyes. He picked up the rock, his hand trembling slightly. He knew about the whispers, the stories of sickness up in the hills. He had chosen to ignore them. He couldn't ignore this, not anymore. He took a deep breath, hitched up his gun belt, and walked to the door. All right, everybody, settle down, he yelled, his voice cracking but firm. This is official business. Disperse now. His words were met with angry jeers. From the smoke and chaos, Bart Logan staggered forward. The side of his face was a bloody mess. His clothes were torn, but his eyes were filled with pure, homicidal rage. Don't listen to him, you fools, Logan roared, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. He's the criminal. He and that squaw. They're trying to steal what's ours. They'll ruin this whole town. The crowd surged, their fear and greed whipped into a frenzy by Logan's words. They believed him. Or they wanted to. His poison paid their bills. Marshal Croft raised his pistol. I'm warning you, Logan. Stand down. Logan just laughed, a terrible broken sound. He raised his own pistol, aiming it straight at Arthur. This ends now, Prescott. Everything seemed to slow down. Arthur saw the hammer on Logan's pistol pull back. He saw the hatred in his eyes. He saw Winona raising her rifle again from horseback, a silent guardian angel. But she was too far away. The marshal was too slow. Then from the side, a figure moved. Henderson. The cowardly, sobbing storekeeper scrambled to his feet. With a wild cry, he threw himself not at Arthur, but at his own partner, at Logan. No, Bart, no more, he screamed. The two men collided. Logan's gun went off, the bullet flying harmlessly into the wooden awning above. They wrestled for a moment, a desperate, clumsy fight between two villains turning on each other at the very end. That was the moment the mob broke. Seeing the two ringleaders fighting, seeing the marshal with his gun drawn, their unity shattered. The truth of it, the ugliness, was too much to ignore. Some men lowered their guns. Others just backed away, disappearing into the alleys, not wanting to be part of what came next. Logan, enraged, threw Henderson to the ground and raised his pistol to finish him. A second shot rang out. Not from the marshal, not from Arthur, from Winona. Her aim was true. Logan cried out, his pistol clattering to the muddy street as he clutched a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. He staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then collapsed. Silence descended on the street of redemption, a heavy, profound silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning general store and the whimpering of Henderson. It was over. The marshal, looking 10 years older, slowly lowered his gun. He looked at Arthur, at the wounded Logan, at the crying Henderson, and finally at Winona, who sat on her horse, proud and unshakable, the smoking rifle held across her lap. "Get him inside," Silas said to a few of the remaining townsmen, his voice full of a weariness that went bone deep. "Lock him up. And him too," he added, nudging Henderson with his boot. "We'll sort this out. The right way. This time." Arthur walked over to Winona's horse. He looked up at her, this woman he had found dying in the snow. This woman who had just saved his life. He saw in her eyes a strength that humbled him. She had lost so much, yet she had never stopped fighting. She had reminded him how. He reached up and put his hand on hers where it rested on the rifle. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She looked down at him, a small, slow smile touching her lips for the first time. "You were like the bear protecting its own." He managed a faint smile back. "Maybe." The spell was broken by the marshal clearing his throat. "Prescott, you got a long report to file, and I suspect you're the star witness." Arthur nodded. There was much to do. Justice had to be seen through. The mine had to be shut down for good. The whole rotten core of the town had to be exposed. But as he stood there in the muddy street, with the smoke of his vengeance filling the air, and Winona's hand warm under his, he felt something he thought was lost forever. Peace. The ice around his heart hadn't just melted. It had been shattered. And in its place, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. The days that followed were a blur of legal wrangling and ugly truths. With Henderson's terrified full confession and the poison stone as undeniable proof, the marshal had no choice but to act. A federal investigation was launched. The illegal mine was seized, and what was left of Logan's gang was rounded up. The town of Redemption was forced to look at the poison it had been built on, and it started the slow, painful process of healing. Through it all, Arthur and Winona stood together. They gave their testimonies, their two stories intertwining to paint a damning picture of greed and murder. In the cold, formal setting of the makeshift courthouse, their bond, forged in snow and fire, only grew stronger. They were a team, a partnership born from the ashes of their shared sorrow. When it was all finally over, they rode away from Redemption without a single look back. They left the smoke and the whispers behind them, heading back to the one place that felt clean. Home. The valley was different now. The snow was finally melting, revealing the first hints of green underneath. The air was warmer, filled with the sound of trickling water and birdsong. The world was coming back to life, and so was Arthur. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. With Winona there, it was filled with a quiet warmth. They worked side by side, repairing the fences, tending the cattle, rebuilding what the winter and the violence had broken. They didn't talk much about the future. They didn't have to. They were living it, one peaceful day at a time. Their love wasn't a whirlwind passion. It was a slow, deep-rooted thing, like an old mountain pine. It was in the comfortable silences as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in hues of orange and purple. It was in the shared smiles over a simple meal. It was in the way his hand would find hers as they walked by the creek, the same creek that had once carried death, but now ran clear and pure again. One evening, they were sitting on the porch step, the air cool and sweet with the promise of spring. "The land is healing," Winona said softly, her gaze on the mountains. Arthur looked out at the familiar view, the same land, the same sky. But she was right. It felt different. It felt alive. He realized it wasn't just the land that had healed. It was him. He had walked into the wilderness to bury his heart. He had built a fortress of ice and sorrow. And then a woman lost in a storm had stumbled into his life. He thought he was saving her, but in the end she was the one who saved him. She had given him more than just justice for his family. She had given him a reason to feel again. He took her hand, his rough fingers lacing through hers. She turned to him, her dark eyes shining in the twilight. "Stay, Winona," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a certainty that was absolute. "Stay and build a life with me. Here." A radiant smile spread across her face, as bright and hopeful as the coming spring. "I am home, Arthur Prescott," she replied. And as the first stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, the man who thought his heart was frozen forever knew that he had finally, truly come in from the cold. What a crazy ride, right? From a simple story of survival to a full-blown murder conspiracy and a town turned upside down. It just goes to show you that sometimes the biggest storms aren't the ones in the sky, but the ones buried in the human heart. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of darkness, mystery, and unbelievable twists, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell, because you have no idea what's coming next.